Kesten, as you've heard. I'm running for the New York State Senate. And the reason I'm running for the New York State Senate is simply because I went to our senator's office and I was told that they have no position on health care. They have no position on certain things with education. They were surprised that I knew that energy comes from Niagara Falls. And when I walked out of that office, the person I went with turned to me and said, "I'm really glad that you talked about health care, because yesterday I was diagnosed with cancer. And they're not having any position when Mr. Murphy is both on the health care committee and the mental health care committee deeply concerns me, and would you run?" And I said, "No, but I'll help you find somebody to run." And then I went home and talked to my son, and my son has schizophrenia. So he is dependent on the safety net. And that was the primary reason that I went up there, was to find out what New York was doing proactively to make sure its citizens didn't suffer in the time of Trump. And when I was told one issue after the other that we have no position on that, we have no position on that, we have no position on that, talking with my son convinced me that I cannot ask someone else to do what I won't do myself. And so reluctantly at first, I decided to consider running, and I went and talked to my town supervisor. I live in the town of Lewisburg. And he said in the 3.5 years that Murphy had been in the Senate, he had never once returned the supervisor's call. And I really questioned what kind of legislator does not respond to a town supervisor in their district. And then the flood came of all the people who have tried to meet with him or get responses from him, and to say the least, there were zero. It was just very disconcerting in the sense that I had been getting mail and I had been getting emails, all touting how wonderful he was and how committed to the district he was. And then I began to realize that all I was hearing about was him slapping himself on the back, saying, "I did this, isn't that great? And I did this, and isn't that great?" But he never once really gave me information so that I could come up with my own conclusions and really form an educated position on what was going on in the state Senate. So through him, I would have learned nothing about the state Senate and its role in our community and how it impacts our daily lives. The only reason I know something is I worked for a former minority leader of the New York State Senate. So I knew what we were doing when I was there. I knew that the work that I did, the senator that I worked for represented the west side of Manhattan all the way down through Chinatown. And so when I worked with the Chinese community, I learned about the Chinese community and their needs. When I worked on other in the East Village or Greenwich Village, I learned what those communities needed and how the fear of development and the fear of gentrification really spooked people because they were going to lose their homes. So I understood what the state Senate could do and what it couldn't do. I didn't have the experience of someone who didn't want to share information. So in the interim of this year of going from town to town, this is our 8th town hall. That's 8 more than Mr. Murphy has done, which I think is important to note that he has not done any town halls. He has done staged events where he comes out, he says a few words, he sits down, and someone else runs the meeting, and he takes credit for it. Just recently, he sent out, as he declared his candidacy in Peekskill, just last week, he went up and he talked about all the things that he did. Things that Sean Patrick Maloney did, things that Kristen Gillibrand has done, things that our new county executive in Westchester, George Latimer, did when he was in the Senate. All of those things miraculously appeared on the list of the things that Senator Murphy had accomplished. He steals. He's not honest. And right now he's sitting on legislation that George Latimer put up in the Senate, which would reimburse Westchester County for property taxes that it does not pay on parks and other state-owned properties. It does pay property tax in every other county in the state, just not Westchester. Latimer proposed that bill a year or two ago. Murphy stopped the bill in the Senate and said it needed to go under review. When Latimer was elected to the county office, Murphy made it his bill. But he's waiting on that bill until he has the perfect opportunity to put it up. Just yesterday, Murphy sent out, or 2 days ago, Murphy sent out a release on the need for governmental photo IDs to vote. This is not the first time he's done that, but he is rallying his base. The other thing he did, interestingly enough, when he was declaring that he was going to run for re-election, is he also told his group of people that were there that he will be running for county executive in Westchester the next time that office comes up, which will be in 2021. I've never heard of somebody announcing their next race before they've completed this race, but he's not your average politician. So, why a Democratic New York State Senate? How many of you would like to see a change in health care? Okay? Held up in the New York State Senate. Why? Because, as I was told when I went up there, as long as we are in control of this body, single payer, Medicare for all, will never see the light of day, so we have no position on it. Who would like to see New York catch up with the rest of the country on voting rights? Okay? Not in the New York State Senate as it is now. Women's health, reproductive rights, moving a woman's right to choose out of the penal code and into the health code. Not happening with this administration. So you have to really wonder why New Yorkers have stuck with a Republican-controlled state Senate. And in part, as we know, they did not. There were 8 members, actually 9, but 8 formed the IDC. The IDC was the Independent Democratic Caucus. They caucused separately from the Democrats, not quite with the Republicans, but the Republicans offered them a deal. And that deal was that they could chair committees, they could chair and sub-chair committees, so they would get extra money for serving. They also got the benefits of being in the majority, so they had more money to give in their districts. So where their Democratic counterparts could only do so much, they could do so much more because they ensured the Republicans' leadership positions. What that also meant was that they had to leave the room when certain legislation came up. Because in the state Senate, if you do not have 32 votes, they don't vote. So therefore, health care, they all signed on to health care. They were all sponsors of the legislation. But when health care came up in the committee, or to be moved from the committee to the floor, those people miraculously disappeared from the state Senate. Voting rights, they all signed on. They're all sponsors of the legislation. But miraculously, they disappear when that legislation came up. Gun control, women's health, all of those things, they were gone. Now, officially, they don't exist anymore. The governor pressured them to close shop and rejoin the Democrats. But what happened was, the chair of the IDC, Jeff Klein, became second in command of the Democratic Party in the state Senate. The person who was there got demoted. Many people suspect that the governor is now moving to make Jeff Klein the leader. And to do that, he is now jumping into races where the candidates were already selected and trying to put in his own candidate. Because then he will have the votes to make Jeff Klein the Democratic leader, replacing Andrea Stewart Cousins, whom he's not particularly fond of, and he has fought publicly with. The complications are Machiavellian and reminiscent of 12th century Florence. But that's what we're living with right now. It's a very peculiar place to be, and we need to be educated so that we can make the right decisions on how to vote, what we're looking for in the legislative process, and how do we protect ourselves so that our government is actually working for us and not for somebody else. So when you look at this, you say the governor is putting people into these different positions, or trying to, upsetting the existence of a process of nominations, a process of selecting candidates. And he's stepping in and saying, I want you out, I want my guy in. So who is that person really representing? Is that person representing the people, or is that person going to be in the state senate representing the governor? And that's something we all have to think of when we go to vote, when we allow this kind of manipulation to take place. Because the state senate, a state senator votes on every single piece of legislation that comes before the state senate. And that legislation touches us much more closely than what happens in Congress and what happens in Washington, D.C. This is the stuff that touches you where you live. This is what decides how much you're going to pay in property tax. The largest part of the budget of the state is your schools. That's over $26 billion at the state level. That's what decides on the curriculum. That's what decides on your housing values based on the quality of your schools. If you don't pay attention to what goes on in the New York State Assembly and the New York State Senate, you are cutting off your nose to spite your face just because Congress is a little bit more exciting because they deal in foreign policy. The reality is that what happens at home touches us more. And yet, our media doesn't cover it well. Our representatives don't give us the information that we need. And so I believe that when you elect someone to the New York State Senate, you should be thinking of someone who is willing to make sure that you have the information that you need to make an intelligent decision about the legislation and the policies that affect your lives. And if that person isn't coming to you on a regular basis to give you that information, you better hold their feet to the fire, because you're being gypped. And nobody should be at taxpayer expense sending out a litany of their great achievements. They should be sending you that litany about how to make a difference in your government, how to hold them responsible, how to know what that law actually means and what it means if that law doesn't happen. We're not getting that, and we should. So, before I open it to a discussion, because that's part of what these things are, it's more about talking back and forth than me talking at you, which I'm glad not to do. I just want to say that this campaign is going to be tough no matter what happens, whether we face the governor's hand-picked person or we just get a clean shot at Murphy. No matter what, it's going to be a tough race. And it means that we really desperately need every single person in every single community, on every single street, that can get out there and do what's necessary, knocking on doors, ringing bells, making phone calls, sending postcards, calling and meeting with their neighbors, setting up meet and greets so that we get to meet as many people as possible. Because if we don't do that, we will see the same trajectory that we've seen time and time again, where we lose and they win. And what we have seen since 2017 is that we can upset that bottle cart. We can make things happen. And the indivisible groups and the other activist groups have shown that money isn't everything, that people power works, and that we, when we work together, can actually change things for the better. So, who wants to ask a question or make a comment?